Director of A.P.E.X. On behalf of myself and the A.P.E.X team, Sophie Javage and Evan Miller, I want to welcome you to the first event of our 2023-2024 season, This America of Ours, Bernard and Avis Devoto, and the Forgotten Fight to Save the Wild. I would like to thank the Eccles for continuous support of this series. Sciences, the Department of History, Sociology, and Anthropology, Outdoor Pathways, the Department of Kinesiology and Outdoor Recreation, and the Provost Office for making this event possible. I would like to remind you that today's conversation will continue this afternoon at 3 p.m. on Thunder 91.1 and the A.P.E.X Radio Hour podcast. Nate Schweber is an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, ProPublica, Anthony Bourdain's Explore Parts Unknown, and various other media outlets. His conservation articles have won awards from the Outdoor Writers Association of America in 2015 and 2018. In 2020, a ProPublica series he contributed to won the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting. His most recent book, This America of Ours, tells the story of Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and writer Bernard Devoto, his brilliant wife and editor Avis, and their band of unlikely allies as they battle lawmakers, private industry, logging and mining operations, and cattle barons to protect millions of acres of public lands from being removed from the public trust. Their dramatic crusade would earn them censorship and blacklisting by Joe McCarthy, J. Edgar Hoover, and Roy Cohn, and it even cost Bernard his life. This America of Ours uncovers the forgotten story of a progressive alliance that altered the course of 20th century history and saved American wilderness and our country's most fundamental ideals from ruin. I should note that we do have copies of This America of Ours for purchase in the lobby, and Nate will host a book signing after his presentation. On another note, he also wrote a book about beer in Indiana. It's now my pleasure to welcome Nate Schweber to Southern Utah University and to the A.P.E.X stage.
Is this on? Terrific. Thank you, Ryan Paul, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to A.P.E.X for giving me the great opportunity to come to Cedar City for the first time. It's beautiful. I want to thank Evan from A.P.E.X and also Sophie from A.P.E.X for finding some Utah peaches for me, which I was so excited about because something about this state grows the best peaches in the world. So, and I especially want to thank Southern Utah University and all of you for being here this late morning to give me an opportunity to tell you about my book, This America of Ours, Bernard and Avis Devoto and the Forgotten Fight to Save the Wild. A quick pronunciation note, the Devotos have one son who is still alive. Mark Devoto is 83 now. I talked to him a number of times. He was very helpful. He let me know that his dad pronounced his name not Bernard, but the English pronunciation, Bernard. So you'll hear me say that. Out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of Bernard Devoto, native son of Utah? A couple hands in the back, some folks, that's great. What about his wife, Avis Devoto, who's a little bit more prominent in pop culture right now for reasons I will touch on? Well, hopefully there'll be a couple more devotees by the time I get done talking about my book. It'll take me a little less than an hour. I'm not proud to admit this, but despite having been born and raised in Missoula, Montana, which is about 90 minutes from this, I didn't know who the DeVotos were until I found a Bernard DeVoto book at the Strand bookstore in New York City, where I now live and work as a freelance journalist. This is the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. It is on the top of the Bitterroot Mountains near the border of Idaho and Montana. It's inside the Clearwater National Forest, which is part of our incredible suite of public lands in America, the national parks being the best known of those. This story that I wrote, this story that I'm going to tell, hopefully with minimal spoilers, it's ultimately a love story. It's a story about an incredible marriage. It's also a story about the McCarthy era, but at base it is a story about public lands and about conservation. So I'm going to tell you why the DeVotos are so honored on our public lands, for the role that they played in the McCarthy era to help protect and defend our public lands. This grainy video shows Bernard DeVoto in 1954 pointing at what began his interest in conservation. That is his maternal grandfather's farm at the base of the Wasatch Mountains near Ogden, Utah. DeVoto was born there in 1897. He was such an adorable little kid that family lore has it that he won a beauty contest. Those days were numbered. This is his mother, Rhoda. She is born into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She falls away from it, becoming what I was told growing up was a Jack Mormon. But it is her father, Samuel, who brings that part of the DeVoto lineage to North America. Samuel immigrates from rainy England to desert Utah in the 1850s when he converts to Mormonism, and he becomes a farmer, which is incredibly difficult. And sometimes in New York City, people who know that I'm from the West will ask me, what is up with public lands? Why are there so many? Why are there different designations? Are they just scenery? Are they just federal tyranny? And the simplest answer that I can give to such a complex question is the same answer that DeVoto's grandpa figured out, which is the same answer that the ancestral Puebloans who lived in this region 1,000 years ago figured out. The answer is water. Because unlike drizzly England, unlike humid New York City, across vast expanses of the American West, enough rain does not fall from the sky to support family farms. The bulk of the precipitation in the West gathers as wintertime snow on the tops of mountains. And the key to survival in the West is getting that snow melt, that water, down from those mountains into the valleys, sometimes multiple states away. And that's where the towns and the ranches and the farms and the cities are. And in order for that to happen, you have to have healthy forests and healthy grasslands. And so at the turn of the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt, our first great conservation president, he established 150 national forests in the West, including the Wasatch National Forest, to protect that water supply above Ogden. And that made a profound impact on young Bernard DeVoto because one of his chores was irrigating his grandpa's farm. Though DeVoto loved the West, loved its history, its scenery, its people, in 1915 he relocated to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he enrolled at Harvard. When World War I came, he enlisted in the Army. You can see in this photo that his nose is now flattened. He tried to play baseball as a boy, and he got his nose shattered by a bat. His days of winning beauty contests were gone forever. But while he was not aesthetically blessed, while he was not athletically gifted, he was astonishingly, almost frighteningly smart, and he knew it. By the time he was in his early 20s, he wrote, quote, "My mind is as good as there is." So you can see that he was humble too. But while his mind was as good as could be, his heart wasn't. Not until in 1922 he met the love of his life, Helen Avis McVicker. Avis DeVoto was born on the Upper Peninsula of Lake Michigan. She grew up surrounded on all sides by Lake Superior. Avis DeVoto was also astonishingly smart. She had a wonderful personality. She had very strong opinions. She was outspoken. Avis was also very stylish, very fashionable. And one thing to know about Avis DeVoto, she was daring. She was absolutely fearless. And the DeVotos were attracted to each other because they shared a love of books and of literature. But it wasn't just the ways that the DeVotos were alike that made them work so well. It was also the ways that they were opposite but complementary. Bernard loved to write. Avis loved to edit. Bernard loved attention. Avis cherished her privacy. Bernard loved to eat. Avis loved to cook. All her life, she was fascinated with food and with cooking. Remember that. This is the first photo of the DeVotos together. This is their honeymoon in 1923. But Avis could never truly know her husband until she knew where he came from, the U.S. West. And so in 1925, Bernard brought Avis to Ogden and introduced her to her father-in-law, Florian DeVoto. He had come west on the Transcontinental Railroad. He stayed in Ogden to work as a land title specialist for the Union Pacific Railroad. And while they were in Ogden, Bernard wanted to show Avis what in his youth had been a paradise, the Wasatch National Forest. So they rented a little cabin in a high mountain valley. And when they got there, they were aghast. In order to boost lumber production in World War I, logging regulations were lifted, but then never put back in place in peacetime. And in order to boost beef and wool production, grazing regulations were lifted, but then never put back in place in peacetime. And when the DeVotos were up in this denuded landscape, a rainstorm hit, and a flash flood came at them, and it almost killed them. The DeVotos made out a lot better than a lot of Westerners in the 1920s because flash floods devastated towns and cities all around this region. Pueblo, Colorado, Silver City, New Mexico, Escalante, Utah, always for the same reason. Conservation failures. Been grazed almost to extinction was the postmortem. So while it was working on his grandpa's farm that gave DeVoto an appreciation for public lands, it was these deadly flash floods of the 1920s that made him understand the imperative of protecting public lands. And that passion, which both DeVotos shared for the rest of their lives, pitted them against the great nemesis of their lives, Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. Senator McCarran is another forgotten figure, and he shouldn't be, because in American history, there has rarely been another politician so powerful, paranoid, vengeful, bigoted, corrupt, and absolutely genius as Pat McCarran. If any of you have ever seen The Godfather Part 2, it begins at Lake Tahoe with the mobster Michael Corleone being shaken down for bribes by Nevada Senator Pat Geary. That is the fictional representation of Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. Early Nevada was so corrupt it was nicknamed the Rotten Borough, and Democratic Senator McCarran embodied that corruption. He cultivated a constituency that lived in mansions at Lake Tahoe and owned enormous ranches out in the desert. And on behalf of this acquisitive constituency, he went to war with a conservation agency that Franklin Roosevelt had created to help fight the Dust Bowl. The Roaring 20s in America were followed by the Dirty 30s. And to protect the deep-rooted native grasses that held soil in place, Franklin Roosevelt created a conservation agency called the Grazing Service. It was modeled after his cousin Teddy Roosevelt's Forest Service. The Grazing Service was to protect the prairies and grasslands and canyon country and desert country of the American West. And Pat McCarran went to war against the Grazing Service in a very manipulative and duplicitous way. He announced that he was going to hold a series of open public meetings all across the West where any citizen could come and give voice to concerns about public lands. But secretly, McCarran curated these meetings to give the longest speaking times and the best speaking times, the most prestigious speaking times, only to the people he wanted to hear from, which were the West's biggest cattle ranchers and biggest sheep barons. So as he amplified the voices of people he wanted to hear from, he diminished and dismissed the voices of people he didn't want to hear from. And this was a plurality of Westerners. These were small ranchers, Native Americans, hunters, hikers, anglers, wildlife lovers, trade unionists, irrigation farmers. It would have included the Devotos. But in the 1930s, the Devotos settled far from the West. They put down roots in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and this is the decade when the Devoto literary star takes off. In 1935, Bernard DeVoto is given the honor of writing the monthly Easy Chair column in Harper's Magazine. This gives him a national platform for his increasingly pointed and increasingly controversial opinions on subjects like conservation. Harper's Magazine didn't pay very well, so to subsidize his income, he wrote serialized fiction for big glossy magazines like the Saturday Evening Post. These were like the Netflix series of that era. And with stories going out and money coming in, the Devotos began to live a seemingly glamorous and kind of glitzy lifestyle. They started to throw these parties that became legendary. If you look at Avis DeVoto on the side of these photos, you can see her reaction to some of the shenanigans that went on at these parties. Their success brought new literary luminaries into their lives, like the poet Robert Frost. But while it looked like the Devotos from the outside were living a rich and successful lifestyle, that really masked the fact that they were going through some pretty intense private and personal turmoil and pain. Robert Frost, pictured here eating wild berries with Avis and appearing to admire her while Bernard holds the camera, he tried to come between the Devotos. And at the same time, Bernard began a relationship with this young woman, Catherine Stern. It was never a physical relationship. Kate Stern was a writer for the New York Times when, in her mid-20s, she caught tuberculosis. And she lived the rest of her life in an iron lung. And from there, she wrote Bernard DeVoto a fan letter. And though they never met in person over the span of more than a decade, they swapped hundreds and hundreds of intimate letters. And Avis knew about this. And she was okay with it. Because Avis knew the private hell that DeVoto was going through, and she was okay with anything that he did to regulate his mood. Part of the reason that DeVoto was going through hell was he dreamed of writing the great American novel. He saw himself as a novelist, and he did write novels, and they were lousy. And they didn't sell very well, and they got mixed reviews, and he had to come to grips with the fact that he didn't have a great novel in him. He was also the type of person, just constitutionally, who wasn't really at home any place or within any group. When he was growing up in Utah, he was too interested in what might be happening in intellectual capitals like Harvard to really fit in. When he was finally at Harvard, he was too fixated on American Western history to really fit in. And nowhere was Bernard DeVoto more of an iconoclast, more of a maverick, more of a total free thinker, always zigging where popular opinion zagged, than politically. In the 1930s, the nation swung far to the left because of the stock market crash and the Great Depression, and millions of Americans voted for socialist and even communist candidates for public office. And within the realm of academia and literature, more than a few voices looked to relatively young Soviet Russia as a potential utopia that America should either emulate or, if need be, submit to. And within his realm, nobody more loudly or rudely than Bernard DeVoto said that anybody that thought that was an idiot. Bernard DeVoto wrote that anybody that thought that Karl Marx was particularly smart, anybody that thought that communism was viable, was suffering from a, quote, imbecile delusion. And so in the 1930s, people called Bernard DeVoto a fascist. And it really weighed heavily on his psyche, all this putting intense pressure on himself, this never really being at home anywhere, this always being a free thinker and suffering the slings and arrows because of that. Devoto went through some suicidal depressions. Thankfully, Avis provided the emotional stability and support to get him through, and come the 1940s, they started a family. They had 2 boys, Gordon and Mark, and this is the decade when the Devoto literary star reaches its heights. Bernard Devoto will write a trilogy of Western history that will win major awards. It will cement his literary reputation, his literary legacy. He finds his true voice writing nonfiction about the West. And the first book in this great trilogy is The Year of Decision, 1846. In cinematic prose, Bernard tells the story of the grit of soldiers, including the Mormon Battalion and the Mexican-American War. He tells about the exodus of Mormons fleeing persecution, looking for religious freedom in the deserts of what would become Utah. He writes about the Donner Party who get stuck atop the Sierra Nevada mountains in the wintertime and survive by cannibalism. This book comes out at the low point of World War II, and it's seen as an allegory for what American soldiers are going through, fighting Imperial Japan and Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And because this book so inspires U.S. soldiers, it becomes a smash hit. Devoto follows it up working farther back in history to the heyday of the Rocky Mountain fur trade. Across the wide Missouri wins the Pulitzer Prize. Bernard Devoto becomes the first son of Utah to win a Pulitzer Prize. This book tells the story of the mountain men. Devoto's next book works even farther back in history. The Course of Empire, which wins the National Book Award, it features 2 characters who Devoto affectionately refers to as my boys, Lewis and Clark. Devoto wrote so expertly and so evocatively about the explorers Lewis and Clark that he would get fan mail like this from some Boy Scouts in Long Island. You can see these scouts have made letterhead with elaborately drawn scenes from the Lewis and Clark expedition, and they've drawn a map of the Lewis and Clark Trail, and these Boy Scouts begged Devoto, take us with you, guide us along the Lewis and Clark Trail, because come 1946, that's exactly what Bernard Devoto intended to do. He was going to take Avis and their boys on the research trip of a lifetime. They were going to drive from Massachusetts to the Pacific Ocean, following the Lewis and Clark Trail and visiting national parks and public lands all along the way. And Devoto intended to write at least one conservation column for Harper's Magazine. And based on what he had been following in the 1930s with the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and the good work it had been doing, Devoto thought that this was going to be a hopeful column. And when the Devotos went west for research, as they did a number of times, they really wanted to do it up. They wanted to talk to everybody that they could. They wanted to learn everything they could. Bernard would go out hiking with Forest Service officials to learn the flora and the fauna, the ecosystems. Avis would befriend National Park Service rangers. They would see the scenic sites. Here are Avis and Gordon in Yellowstone. Avis would ride on chairlifts to the top of peaks in the Colorado Rockies so she could get panoramic views. Bernard Devoto was too afraid of heights to join them. But he would go buzzing around with smoke jumpers that took off from Missoula, Montana. They would get out on the water. This is Avis looking typically stylish in the middle of Jenny Lake in Grand Teton National Park. Bernard would float in a little boat down the Missouri River in eastern Montana with the great novelist Bud Guthrie Jr. like they were characters in a Mark Twain story. But one thing Bernard Devoto would always do is he would drop down on his hands and knees and check out the grass, because he wanted to see if the ranges were being overgrazed. And the answer to that question after 1946 was yes, because of Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. With the world distracted by war, those McCarran hearings on public lands escalated, and they took on a sadistic twist. McCarran began to order employees of the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service and the Grazing Service to attend his meetings, and he would forbid them to speak while he invited his hand-picked audience members to shout insults at them. A McCarran aide said the purpose was to affect these conservation professionals, quote, psychologically, unquote. And in the 1940s, McCarran began to assert that anybody that disagreed with him, anybody who dissented from him, was disloyal to America. And he began to say that America was getting filled up with communists who were going to destroy America, and that he, Pat McCarran, would stop this from happening by finding all of them. So during the war, McCarran went from just amplifying voices of people he wanted to hear from and diminishing and dismissing voices of people he didn't want to hear from, to demonizing people he didn't want to hear from. And again, this is a plurality of Westerners. These are small ranchers, Native Americans, hunters, hikers, anglers, wildlife lovers, trade unionists, municipal water suppliers, irrigation farmers. Based on those rigged hearings that McCarran led, he flexed his power on the Senate Appropriations Committee, and he defunded the U.S. Grazing Service so much that he killed it, this conservation agency that FDR created to help fight the Dust Bowl. In 1946, the new president, Harry Truman, took what was left of the defunded U.S. Grazing Service, and he combined it with the moribund and historically corrupt General Land Office to create a new and enfeebled conservation agency, the Bureau of Land Management. This is the birth of the BLM, the first BLM. It should better have been called the Bureau of Pat McCarran. The environmentalist Edward Abbey would soon write that BLM stood for Bureau of Livestock and Mining, which is exactly what Pat McCarran wanted. The Devotos go west the same month that the BLM is born, June 1946, and they don't yet realize the implications of this. They go in their 6-year-old Buick sedan, stuffed with all the supplies that they're going to need for 3 months, and when they first get to the west, they're having a great time. They're seeing the sights, they're learning history, they're stopping by roadside markers, they're buying souvenirs, they're posing for family photos. But what they see becomes tragic when they reach the Dakotas, and they see the beginnings of the Garrison Dam. The Garrison Dam across the Missouri River is going to create a reservoir that will flood out some 150,000 acres of the homelands of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations, all without permission from those nations. This painful photograph is of the signing that officially, quote, authorized, unquote, the already under construction Garrison Dam. The gentleman weeping is the sole representative for those tribal nations. The Devotos can't believe that they're seeing scenes like this. They thought that scenes like this were something out of the 1800s. They're aghast to see them happening in the mid-1900s. And Bernard DeVoto knows from his deep study of U.S. history that the biggest public land scams, the biggest public domain frauds, went hand in hand with this kind of mass native dispossession because the common denominator is greed. It's natural resource looting, natural resource plundering. DeVoto can chart the entire history of Western settlement through a series of natural resource raids, first for gold, then fur, then grass and timber and oil and water and the land itself. DeVoto knows that if he's seeing scenes like this in Indian country, he needs to have his eyes and ears wide open in case there's an even bigger plot being worked up against federally protected lands in the U.S. West, some bigger plot that might trace back to Nevada Senator Pat McCarran, seen here on a reservoir catching a bass. Following the Lewis and Clark Trail, the Devotos get to the small eastern Montana community of Miles City, and they go to the Range Riders Cafe. Because remember, Bernard DeVoto loves to eat, and he knows that the Range Riders serves the best steak in America. He will gleefully tell his readers on the eastern seaboard that for no amount of money in their time zone could they get a steak anywhere near as good as the one that he could get for $1.50 at the Range Riders. But while they're in there, they eavesdrop, and Bernard DeVoto overhears a, quote, very loud, very drunk cattleman, unquote, give him a tip. DeVoto learns that his hunch was correct, that there is an even bigger plot being worked up and kept secret in the West, that the tactics that Pat McCarran used to destroy the U.S. Grazing Service were next going to be used to destroy the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service. And at this juncture, the DeVotos transform into investigative journalists, and their freewheeling National Park Lewis and Clark adventure turns into an epic networking odyssey. And they go across the West and they meet with sources, and they ask these people if they know anything about this plot. In Great Falls, Montana, the DeVotos meet with Joseph Kinsey Howard, who is rightfully in the Montana Journalism Hall of Fame. He wrote one of the best books about the state, Montana, High, Wide, and Handsome. In Yosemite National Park, they meet with the great landscape photographer Ansel Adams. They ask him if he knows anything that's going on. In Wyoming, they meet with their mutual friend Wallace Stegner, the great novelist, adopted son of Utah. Stegner is the one who said that national parks are America's best idea. But they get their big break in DeVoto's hometown of Ogden when they meet with this guy, Chet Olson. He is a Forest Service official who through the 1930s led hundreds of CCC workers up into the Wasatch Mountains. And they replanted trees, and they replanted grass, and they stopped those deadly floods. And Olson knew something. He knew that in August 1946 in Salt Lake City, around 150 of the West's biggest cattle ranchers and sheep barons were going to gather. And at that gathering, a small group was going to meet in private, and they were going to secretly hash out a legislative agenda. And this legislative agenda would have all the details that the DeVotos had been searching for, from the Dakotas through Montana and Idaho and Washington and Oregon and California and Nevada and Utah and Wyoming and Colorado. All of these details would be revealed there. And of course, presiding over this entire Salt Lake meeting was Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. Somehow, that Forest Service official got a copy of this secret document into Bernard DeVoto's hands, and what he read set his stubby hair on fire. The plot was this: to take every single acre under the new and enfeebled Bureau of Land Management, around 150 million acres, transfer them to states and sell them off, and then have Pat McCarran-approved survey crews go into the national parks and monuments and forests and transfer out an additional perhaps 80 million acres. All told, the amount of acreage at stake was 230 million. This was equivalent to almost everything that Teddy Roosevelt protected. This would end conservation in America. Bernard DeVoto called it a land grab, the biggest land grab in American history. This calico-looking map that Westerners know shows roughly what was at stake. The yellow are BLM lands, the light green are Forest Service lands, the salmon color is Indian country, the dark green are our national parks. DeVoto writes, Senator McCarran has been the ablest representative of cattle and sheep interests in Washington against the West and the people of the United States. And he puts that in the January 1947 issue of Harper's Magazine in a double-length feature story that he titles The West Against Itself, that being a reference to politicians like McCarran who, for short-term profit and political gain, would liquidate the natural resources of the West, which is to say, the future of the West and of America. And DeVoto spells out in plain language the complex plot that's going on. He writes, the plan is to get rid of public lands altogether, turning them over to the states, which can be coerced as the federal government cannot be, and eventually to private ownership. This is your land we are talking about. DeVoto writes this, incidentally, just a few years after Woody Guthrie has written This Land Is Your Land, but before that song becomes a classic. That article, The West Against Itself, it does everything that the Devotos want. Devoto remembers later that his article, quote, fused an explosion. It rendered that land grab suite of legislation too radioactive for any politician to touch, even Pat McCarran. They stopped as many as 230 million acres from being sold off in the 1940s. But as the 1940s turn into the 1950s, a powerful new ally comes to the aid of Senator Pat McCarran, or rather, somebody who had been a nobody in Congress became maybe the most powerful member of Congress by starting to act like Pat McCarran. You'll remember that Pat McCarran in the 1940s said that America was becoming filled up with communists who were going to destroy the country from within and needed to all be rooted out. That's what Joe McCarthy started to say in 1950, but when Joe McCarthy said it, it went that era's version of viral. You'll notice that when Pat McCarran gets fan mail, it comes with stickers on it that say, "I'm for McCarthy." One of the challenges that historians have had in writing about the McCarthy era, named for Wisconsin Senator and demagogue Joe McCarthy, is that when it came to the man himself, there wasn't much there. Joe McCarthy didn't have coherent values. He didn't have consistent principles. The two things that Joe McCarthy could always be counted on to want were alcohol and attention, which are two things that I also always want, but I'm not in politics. Pat McCarran is the godfather of McCarthyism. If you wanted to know what was going to come out of the mouth of young Republican Joe McCarthy, you needed to only look at what had just come out of the mouth of old Democrat Pat McCarran. And McCarran and McCarthy became a duo, because each one of them had something that the other did not. Joe McCarthy had a genius for attracting attention to himself, for getting publicity. This is why we talk about the McCarthy era and McCarthyism, rather than what it should be called, the McCarran era and McCarranism. But Pat McCarran had a genius for legislating. Joe McCarthy could never pass a law. The actual laws that codify McCarthyism were all passed by Pat McCarran, and these are some of the most repressive laws in American history. There was a concentration camp law that McCarran passed. And Joe McCarthy's innovation was rhetorical. It was a way of speaking. It was the art of the smear. It was a way of making innocent people sound dangerous through innuendo and inference and allusion. It was a way of achieving a dramatic effect while eliding responsibility. And that McCarthyist way of talking started to get picked up on by Pat McCarran's allies in the West, including a gentleman named J. Elmer Brock, one time the president of the powerful Wyoming Stock Growers Association. After Bernard DeVoto thwarted the land grab, J. Elmer Brock decided to inform on Bernard DeVoto to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. Brock did it on his livestock company's stationery. And Brock told Hoover that as far as the sentiments of the stockmen in the West, we would like to see Bernard hanging from a cottonwood limb. This is in DeVoto's FBI file. And maybe that's fine. Maybe that's just a guy blowing off some steam, except that the J. Elmer Brock included an article that the stock growers had published in their own magazine. And that article asked if the United States would be better if Bernard DeVoto just moved to Russia, or whether he should have a hammer and sickle over his desk. This is also in DeVoto's FBI file, and you can see that the hammer and sickle line is underlined, and there's a big black arrow drawn to it. Now, if the Wyoming stock growers had written, quote, Bernard DeVoto is a communist, unquote, Bernard could sue them for libel. But if they just ask whether America would be better if he moved to Russia, or whether he ought to have a hammer and sickle over his desk, they achieve that dramatic effect while eliding responsibility. That's the essence of McCarthyism. And that style of talk, and the fact that the FBI was now collecting it, was of grave concern to Bernard DeVoto, pictured here at his desk with neither a hammer nor a sickle over it. DeVoto saw it as a threat to Americans' freedom because it jeopardized the Bill of Rights, which guarantees due process. And so in late 1949, DeVoto wrote the most controversial column of his career. "Do Notice to the FBI." This is one of the first articles in a national magazine to criticize Joe McCarthy, but more so, it takes the FBI to task for gathering up McCarthy-style gossip and backbiting and slander and innuendo. When this article came out, a Gallup poll showed that 78% of Americans thought that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were doing a good job, versus only 2% that thought they were doing a bad job. This article shows Bernard DeVoto at his most free-thinking, at his most maverick, at his most courageous. And when this article appeared, J. Edgar Hoover was furious. People did not criticize the FBI. And so J. Edgar Hoover put Bernard DeVoto on a do not contact list, and he sent out a warning about due notice to the FBI to every FBI headquarters in all 48 states and all 3 territories, warning them about it. And Hoover launched an FBI investigation into a question that really bothered him. Had a specific person inspired Bernard DeVoto to write due notice to the FBI? I don't want to give spoilers. I can tell you that J. Edgar Hoover and his agents failed. They did not find whether a specific person inspired DeVoto to write that column, and at the risk of sounding self-aggrandizing, I can tell you that I did. The answer is deep inside of DeVoto's archive at Stanford University, and instead of being somebody you might think like a Harvard University professor or a neighbor of the DeVotos at Cambridge, it instead turned out to be this guy. His name is Roald Peterson, and he lived in my hometown of Missoula, Montana. He worked as a Forest Service ranger, and his job was regulating grazing ranges. This is exactly the type of public servant that Pat McCarran wanted to drum out of a job. And the story of what happened to Roald Peterson I learned by finding one of his granddaughters who's still alive. And she told me a story that had been passed down by her late mother. And it was Baroque, and it was tragic, and it was ridiculous. But I was able to find documents inside the Montana Historical Society, inside the Missoula County Courthouse, and inside Roald Peterson's FBI file that provided contemporary corroboration of this 75-year-old piece of oral history. What happened to Roald was that in 1949, 2 anonymous FBI informants accused him of having once been a communist. They were wrong. At best, they were mistaken. At worst, they were malicious. But because he was accused, he had to undergo a loyalty investigation. And while his loyalty was being investigated, Montanans of every political stripe, by the dozen, came out and said he was a good guy, said he was an asset to the state and to the republic. But while this investigation was going on, it was hell on his family. Roald had married a woman that he met in New Orleans, and during the loyalty investigation, she suffered a psychotic break. And her sister would have her committed to what was then, unfortunately, known as the East Louisiana Asylum for the Insane. And while she was on her way there, she talked to a man in New Orleans, and that guy decided to also inform on Roald Peterson to the FBI, based on his impression of a conversation that he had with a soon-to-be ex-spouse who was on her way to a literal insane asylum. That's not a trustworthy source. That source told the FBI that it sounded to him like Roald was, quote, behaving like a homosexual, unquote. This is in Roald Peterson's FBI file. Now, this came at a time, mind you, when Joe McCarthy was going across America saying he was out to expose all, quote, communists and queers, combining the two in the American mind, which was high irony. Because working for Joe McCarthy, as he had just worked for Pat McCarran, was the infamous attorney Roy Cohn, a gay man who at that time was secretly in love with the gentleman sitting on the other side of Joe McCarthy, G. David Schein. But for Americans who were not as politically connected as Roy Cohn, the results could be tragic. Based on that new false allegation, Roald was investigated again. And this time he was fired from the U.S. Forest Service. And because of that, he lost his family's ranch in Montana's Bitterroot Valley. If any of you have seen the TV show Yellowstone, the actual property that they have cast as the Dutton Home Ranch, that actual ranch is in Montana's Bitterroot Valley. Rold lived not too far away. That's an example of what was taken from him. Montana judge deciding custody of the kids between an institutionalized mom and an accused dad put the kids into foster care, and they were sexually abused. And the two youngest ones ended up committing suicide. This is the human cost of McCarthyism. And something not dissimilar happened to another Bernard DeVoto conservation ally. This is Wyoming Senator Lester Hunt. His son was arrested on suspicion of being gay, and two of McCarran and McCarthy's Senate allies blackmailed Senator Hunt and told him that if he did not resign immediately, Joe McCarthy was going to go to Wyoming and publicize his son's arrest. This came 45 years before the brutal murder of gay University of Wyoming student Matthew Shepard. I won't tell you what happened to Senator Hunt. You'll have to read my book. We have all seen some of Senator Hunt's legacy. He was the guy that chose this to be the emblem of the state of Wyoming, the buckaroo on the Bronco. What Bernard DeVoto could see was that a pattern had emerged, that people who stood between Pat McCarran and his attempts to grab public wealth, those people found themselves investigated, harassed, targeted, persecuted. And come the 1950s, McCarran had a new way to grab public wealth and funnel it to his Western cronies. Dams. Multi-million dollar dams. By the middle of the 20th century, America had spent more money on water infrastructure than anything except the military. And nobody was better at grabbing that pork barrel spending than Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. And I don't have to tell a Utah audience, dams are an incredibly complex conservation topic. They make life possible for millions of people in the West. They also often misallocate water and do bad ecological damage. Getting a right balance is incredibly difficult, but that balance was at risk of being permanently overturned in the 1950s because so many dams had already been built that some of the only places left where a dam could be built were inside national parks. Because to build a dam, you have to have certain physical parameters. You have to have a canyon. Once again, McCarran flexed his might on the Senate Appropriations Committee. He withheld money from the National Park Service so that it could not defend itself, and he poured money into the two big dam building agencies, the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers. And so, empowered by McCarran, those agencies drew up plans to build dams either inside of or close enough to flood out significant portions of national park units, including the Grand Canyon in Arizona, Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, Glacier National Park in Montana, Kings Canyon National Park in California, Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. This wasn't just a Western issue. Fort Donelson National Battlefield in Tennessee. But the first guillotine blade to fall, the first domino to drop, was going to be a dam built here in the middle of Dinosaur National Monument, which straddles the border of Colorado and DeVoto's home state of Utah. If a dam could be built inside Dinosaur National Monument, that would give the green light for all those other dam projects to move forward. And if America could not protect its national parks, its best beloved and most well-known of all public lands, no other acre of public land stood a chance against being eventually exploited and liquidated. And DeVoto knew what he had to do. He had done it before. He would write another blockbuster magazine article. He would let people know what was going on. But he wanted this article to reach even more eyeballs than Harper's Magazine. And so he placed it in the biggest and best read news magazine of his era, the Saturday Evening Post. And he gave it another attention-grabbing headline, "Shall We Let Them Ruin Our National Parks?" This article let the American public know about the threats that dams posed to national parks and, by extension, all our public lands. That's a photo of Dinosaur National Monument in the background. And what happened when DeVoto let the American people know about yet more malfeasance that ultimately Senator Pat McCarran was behind? Well, it got DeVoto attacked nationwide by McCarran's understudy, Joe McCarthy. In the lead up to the 1952 presidential election, the person who Joe McCarthy himself attacked most conspicuously often and most viciously was none other than public lands champion Bernard DeVoto. But this being Joe McCarthy, when he went on nationwide TV to tell America to be afraid of Bernard DeVoto, he called him, this is the audio portion of the presentation,
Richard DeVoto.
In case you couldn't quite make that out, that was Joe McCarthy calling Bernard DeVoto Richard DeVoto. Unfortunately, McCarthy was not done. He began to attack magazines that published Bernard DeVoto's conservation articles. And this was a crisis for conservation because Bernard DeVoto was the most important spokesman of his era for public lands. It was also a crisis for the DeVoto family, because if DeVoto couldn't get published, they couldn't keep a roof over their head. This was their livelihood. Fortunately, Bernard had Avis, and Avis had Bernard, and they began collaborating together more closely than ever before, brainstorming new and different types of story ideas that Bernard could pitch and write, sometimes under a pseudonym, to compensate for his having been blacklisted from the Saturday Evening Post and Reader's Digest and Fortune magazine. Avis suggested that Bernard write a column for Harper's Magazine about kitchen knives. Because remember, she's fascinated with cooking. And after he did, that got him a fan letter from a new fan and ally, Julia Child. One of the things that Avis did for Bernard was she answered a lot of his fan mail. So Avis wrote Julia back, Julia wrote Avis back, and they became best friends for the rest of their lives. And Julia Child confided something in Avis DeVoto. She said that she had a dream of writing a encyclopedic French cookbook, and Avis was so excited and inspired by this idea of this new friend named Julia Child that she made a promise. Avis DeVoto promised Julia that she would use Bernard DeVoto's contacts in the publishing industry to get her a breakout book deal. This friendship between the DeVotos and the Childs, it's very famous, it's very well known, and it also affected both families a lot more than has been previously acknowledged. And if you'll bear with me, I wanted to use this kind of show and tell format just to give you a taste, no pun intended, of the depth of emotion and of love that was part of this great friendship between the DeVotos and the Childs. The Childs added the DeVotos to a select list of dear friends to whom they would always send handmade valentines. Paul Child was a very talented artist, and he would make valentines that could be kind of funny and whimsical, like this Victorian-looking scene. Sometimes the valentines could be risque. Here are Paul and Julia in the bathtub together. Sometimes the valentines could be very ornate. This one that Paul hand-painted looks like it could be a stained glass window. Sometimes Paul's composition could be risque. This was a photo that Julia took of him painting en plein air, shall we say. This is a poem that Paul wrote on the back of that valentine, and you'll see that on the far side, the first letter of every line spells from top to bottom, to Avis and Bernard. This is Julia Child's kitchen in France in 1953, and on the shelf where you might expect to find a cookbook, instead you find The Course of Empire by Bernard DeVoto. This is a collection of cards of organizations that Bernard DeVoto belonged to. There's ones you expect. There's his National Parks Lifetime Pass, his Sierra Club membership card, his membership in the Outdoor Writers Association of America, and in the top corner is his official honorary membership in the L'École des Trois Gourmands, the cooking school that Julia Child taught in France. This friendship between the Childs and the DeVotos is very famous, especially between Avis and Julia. And it should be. It's very well documented. Their archive of letters is at Harvard University. It's been in books. It's been on TV. It's been in a hit movie. What people don't realize about this wonderful friendship is that it came together because of the DeVoto's McCarthy-era fight to protect and defend our public lands. And the Childs weren't the only new friend and ally that came into the DeVoto's lives. I'll let this logger in Montana introduce the next one. He says, "I'll be goddamned, I never thought I'd meet Adlai Stevenson here." Adlai Stevenson was the Democratic nominee for president in 1952 and 1956, and in 54 he asked Bernard DeVoto to meet him in Missoula, Montana, and give him a field lesson in conservation. So DeVoto took him up into the Bitterroot Mountains and taught him about chain smoking. I'm joking. He taught him about his passion, rangeland health. Grass holds the soil. Friends, this is grassroots politics. And Stevenson begins to get the DeVoto philosophy. Somebody's left a sloppy campsite, and he says, "Clean it up, you son of a bitch." But DeVoto impresses on Stevenson that the number one reason for public lands conservation is to protect the sources of clean, cold water, which is the lifeblood of the West. Stevenson tries catching a trout in some. If Adlai Stevenson is elected, Bernard DeVoto is probably going to either be his Secretary of Agriculture or Secretary of the Interior, but DeVoto is thinking ahead just in case Stevenson is not the guy to get his public lands conservation ideas into the White House. DeVoto is also keeping up a robust conservation correspondence with his senator in Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. But that's all in the future. Come 1955, the crisis for conservation in America is this river, the Green River, and whether a dam is going to be built on it in Dinosaur National Monument, taking a landscape that looks like this and making it look like this. And the American people don't want this. Letters to members of Congress about this proposed dam are 80-1 against it. But the dam still has all the momentum it needs to get built because nobody uses minority power in government better than Nevada Senator Pat McCarran, who is simultaneously marshaling all the cultural power of McCarthyism. People who oppose this dam get called disloyal and weak and gay. At the height of the fight against this dam, even Paul Child got investigated. The only reason that Julia was in France in the first place learning how to be a chef was because Paul Child was stationed there with the State Department. He was accused of being gay, despite all the documentary evidence he could provide to the contrary. Avis DeVoto would always think that his being investigated was somehow retribution for the Childs being friends with the DeVotos. And all of this weighed heavily on Bernard DeVoto's psyche. All of the nasty politics, all the worry for his country, meaning the public lands of the West, all the worry for his country, meaning the United States. DeVoto asked if our wilderness was destroyed, how in 100 years would anybody know what wonders there were in this America of ours? But in late 1955, he got another one of these opportunities that he always tried to capitalize on, an opportunity to talk to a mass audience of Americans about conservation. He was asked to go to CBS studios in New York City and be on a TV show called Adventure and tell the story of Mesa Verde National Park. Mesa Verde in southwest Colorado is a homeland of the ancestral Puebloan people who lived in the southwest for centuries. They built irrigated farms and towns. The ancestral Puebloans built the tallest skyscrapers in America until Chicago in the 1880s. And tree rings tell the story that around the year 1200, the climate warmed a little bit. And megadrought struck, and the ancestral Puebloans abandoned their farms and towns and cities, and they vanished. And DeVoto thought that a parable about a civilization in the American West that vanished when it didn't conserve its water would somehow tilt American public opinion about dam building toward caution and conservation and preservation. And DeVoto wanted to put everything that he had into this broadcast, all his traveling around the West, all his learning about the West, all his writing about the West, his growing up in the West, his talking to Westerners, his bringing new conservation allies into the West, like this gentleman in the white hat right there. That is book publisher Alfred Knopf. Remember him? DeVoto wanted this broadcast infused with the spirit of all the cigarettes he smoked in the West, all the fun he had with his friends in the Forest Service, all the laughs he had. This is the part in my soon-to-be-done presentation when I have to apologize to you, dear audience, because despite my aversion to spoilers, I don't know how to not tell you here that Bernard DeVoto doesn't make it. He dies right after that broadcast, November 13, 1955. But had he lived until the end of the month, he would have seen headlines like this all over America. A victory for Bernard DeVoto. Because of the coalition he built and led, he convinced the Eisenhower administration to not build a dam inside Dinosaur National Monument. This upheld the sanctity of the National Park Service. This upheld the precedent of not exploiting and liquidating all acres of America's public lands. The credit should certainly go to Bernard DeVoto, but it should equally go to Avis DeVoto. And when Bernard DeVoto died at 58, Avis was only 51. And she was devastated because not only had she lost her romantic partner of 33 years, she also lost her professional partner. She went through all the stages of grief. Fortunately, Avis had one of history's great best friends. Julia Child rushed a plane ticket to Avis DeVoto and brought her to Europe, and Julia spent weeks nurturing Avis and cooking for her and caring for her and showing her around and setting her heart on the path eventually to healing. And Avis had a realization. She realized that though she would never have another romantic partner, she could have another professional partner. And so Avis transferred to Julia Child all the professional skills that she had lent to Bernard DeVoto. Copy editing and proofreading and editing and indexing and fan mail answering. Avis was the only person who Julia allowed to answer her fan mail. And Avis kept that promise that she made to Julia. She did use Bernard DeVoto's contacts in the publishing industry to make sure that Mastering the Art of French Cooking Volumes 1 and 2 got published by Alfred Knopf. Through this presentation, I've shown you a little bit of film of Bernard DeVoto from a home movie that I saw moldering in an archive. I wasn't able to find any film of Avis, so the closest I can come to showing you what animate Avis looks like comes, courtesy of fair use laws, from the silver screen. This is Deborah Rush in the 2009 movie Julie and Julia, opposite Meryl Streep playing Avis DeVoto. Right now on HBO Max is a series called Julia, which stars Bebe Neuwirth as Avis DeVoto. This is one of the great friendships in American history. This is a friendship that came together because of the DeVoto's McCarthy-era fight to save our national parks and public lands. When Avis was elderly, she joined with women in her adopted hometown of Cambridge, and they got this built. This is JFK Memorial Park, and for her efforts in 1984, the Cambridge City Council voted unanimously to honor Avis by etching her name into Harvard Square. So today at the corner of Mount Auburn and Brattle is a ledge that reads, Bernard and Avis DeVoto, Friends of Cambridge Conservation. Though Bernard had been dead for decades, Avis insisted that his name be beside hers. Of course, that's not the only place where the DeVotos are publicly honored. There's also the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove at the top of the Bitterroot Mountains in the Clearwater National Forest. That grove was dedicated in September 1962. That is their friend Chet Olson speaking at the dedication ceremony. The person who escorted Avis to the ceremony was Montana Senator Lee Metcalf, pictured with Avis there on the front of my hometown newspaper. And at the ceremony, Senator Metcalf read aloud a special message from President Kennedy. And Kennedy began by honoring Avis. And he talked about how he had been inspired by Bernard DeVoto. And Avis would write Kennedy back. Avis would also visit the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove one more time. After Bernard DeVoto died, Avis arranged for his ashes to be spread over those red cedar trees from a smoke jumper plane. And when Avis died, her son Mark, pictured with her there at the dedication ceremony, he brought her ashes to the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. He spiritually and literally brought his parents, Bernard and Avis DeVoto, back together again. In that September 1962 thank you letter that Avis wrote to President Kennedy, she offered him some advice. Because Avis was daring like that, she would offer unsolicited advice to the President of the United States. Avis advised Kennedy that one day he should visit the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. She told him that although there were more scenically awesome places in America, she had never found anywhere else at once so majestic and so peaceful. We know that Kennedy was never able to take her up on that advice, but I feel like it's good advice to end on. If you are ever fortunate enough to be traveling Highway 12 across the Bitterroot Mountains near the border of Idaho and Montana, you should stop at the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. You'll find that it is still everything that Avis said it was. And even if you're not able to stop, even if all you can do is take note of the highway sign as you pass by, Now you know. There's a pretty interesting story behind it. Thank you, Southern Utah University.